good to see everyone out for Sunday night Bible study. I want to say I really appreciate the card that you guys gave me. I was reading that earlier, and that was a very nice card. I really do appreciate that. I really have enjoyed so far my work here, and like I said this morning, I'm really fond of you guys, so that was really, just makes me feel encouragement to know that people appreciate what you do as a minister. So I appreciate that. I was able to go and visit Joanne this afternoon at the courtyard. We had a really good visit, and while we were there, I was reading some Bible verses, and some of the other residents, they were, I guess they thought we were having a church service or something. I said, no, I'm just reading some Bible verses, and one of the ladies came over there and asked me to pray with her, so, I was glad to do it, But, there's a feeling that you get from helping people like that, going to nursing homes, that you just can't get any other way. There's no substitute for being able to help people in that way. And of course, the Bible talks about our responsibilities as Christians to take care of the weak, take care of the elderly and widows and orphans. If there's any group that God really has a special interest for, it's widows and orphans and unfortunate people. So it's not just for their benefit, it's for us too. When God puts those things in His Word, it's so we can get blessings in our own life. It's just, like I said, it's indescribable, the feeling that you get, because you know that you brighten somebody's day that otherwise would just maybe not have been having a good day or been lonely or whatever it may be. It's always good to be able to help people in that way. So that was a very good visit we had today. So we are up to Numbers 33. Is everybody excited that we're almost through this book? Everybody deserves a pat on the back. We're almost done with the entire book of Numbers. This is a good feat here. This is nothing to shake a stick at. This is, we've almost covered this, and we'll be done. We may be done tonight, because chapters 33 and 34, there's not a lot to really go over. And then chapters 35 and 36, there's some meat there. But are there any questions or comments up to this point on this book? So, like I said, we're almost done, and just remember that you really deserve a pat on the back here, because we've been covering some ground, and this study, I've tried not to rush through it. Other people may have been able to do this quicker than me. I could have done it quicker. But, I wanted to stop whenever we had to and camp out and make sure that people understand what we're looking at here. And I think we've really taken our time and been able to look at a lot of good things here. So, but before we get started, I need to correct something from last week on my geography. Did anybody notice something odd? If you didn't, I probably couldn't have not said a word about it, and nobody would have noticed. But let me just put here what I had last week. We had the River Jordan here, so this is Jordan. And what I said last week was we were over here, going this way, okay? This week we're going to reverse that, and we're going that way. Here's why I got it mixed up. When you get to chapter 20 of Numbers, you start a whole new timeline. As we've seen, it's the 40th year. Now, in chapter 20, they come out into Kadesh, okay? So Kadesh is more down in this area. But it is from west going that way. So that's why I was thinking that. Not only that, my mind was so focused of coming out of Egypt, because that is the main focal point of Exodus and the wilderness, is they're coming from Egypt, coming this way, because Egypt's over here. Is everybody with me? They're going this way the whole time. But this time, what we're looking at, they're in the plains of Moab, okay? And they're over here. So Israel is right here. So what they're doing, they're coming up this way, and they're going from east to west. So they're going to Canaan's land. I'm on my way that way. Is everybody with me? I hope I'm not confusing people, because last week I had it totally messed up. But they were going that way at one time. It's not because I didn't do my study or something. It's because I had my mind so focused on Egypt and going this way, from west to east. But this time they're going this way. They're crossing Jordan into Canaan. So this chapter we studied last week of Ephraim, Gad, and Manasseh, they're wanting to get land and stay over on this side, and then they're wanting to go over and help fight and come back over this way.
That's where all the cattle grazing and
Yeah, this land over here is apparently good for livestock and everything like that. So they went to Moses and said, "Can we just camp out here and go fight and come back and get our lot here?" But remember what we said. They were such in a hurry to get this land over here to be number one. They were the first ones also to go into captivity. So when you get in a hurry and maybe get a little bit greedy and stuff, just remember you're probably it's probably going to blow up in your face, because that's kind of what happened with them. But I hope that everybody's not confused about that. But just remember, this time this is the Jordan River right here. So we got Jordan River, and they come up this way, and they're going over into Canaan this way. So over here is Canaan. Is everybody good on that? All right. I apologize for that. I hope I didn't throw everybody off too bad. Okay. So now that we've got that taken care of, we're in chapter 33, and this chapter here, I'm not going to go through every verse. It's a list of every station from coming out of Egypt to the border of Canaan, to where they are now. There's 42 stations here. Every stop.
Okay.
So every time, and they wouldn't have had that many, remember, if they could have went into the land, if they hadn't disobeyed. But you got to remember, when they disobeyed at Kadesh, when they sent the 12 spies over and came back and they were postponed, they went from an 11-day journey to a 40-year journey. And what they're doing, they're going around in a maze like a labyrinth. God's just letting them go. The cloud's just taking them all over the place, just to train them. And it's part of their punishment. So that's why they're not in the land of Canaan. So that's why there's 42 different stops or stations here, because this gives you the entire history. Just a couple of interesting facts about this chapter. Every station that we have here is completely in tune with what we see from Exodus when they came out of Egypt, except for, I didn't bring my phone up here. I want to make sure I got this right. It's all exactly with that, except for so every station adds up with the book of Exodus, except for we have mentioned here two places, Dophkah and Alush, in verses 12 to 14, that we don't find in the book of Exodus. And it's not that there's a contradiction, it's just for some reason it was not recorded in Exodus. And I'll just read those verses. It says, verse 12, "And they took their journey out of the wilderness of Sin and encamped in Dophkah. And they departed from Dophkah and encamped in Alush, and removed from Alush and encamped in Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink." Now, Rephidim is in Exodus. We see in chapter 17, they went to Rephidim, there was no water, they complained about the water. And then there's actually one more. Verse 10, it says they removed from Elim and encamped by the Red Sea. That's not recorded in Exodus either. And what the reason for that is, I don't know. I just wanted to show you that it's basically all the same except for these two names here and the stop at the Red Sea. And that's in verse 10 and verses 12 to 14 if you're interested in that kind of thing. So, but basically, it's basically the same list except for those two places. Another interesting fact is from verses 19 to verse 36, that encompasses the 40-year wanderings. That's every station. That's every stop. So from verses 19 to 36. And let's see here. Is there anything else I want to say about this chapter? Yes, there actually is a couple of things I want to say about this. So just remember, from verse 1 all the way up to verse 49, you have every stop that they've made so far. So if you want to go-to little guide to see every stop they made.
With the map,
Yeah, I mean, and you know, here's the thing. This is not going to make any sense to you unless you have a map. When you study this, you have got to get a map out. I realize that. Unless you've had a Bible geography class and you're an expert on that, you're going to need to break out your maps and look at this, because none of this stuff's going to make sense to you if you don't. So, and the truth about it is, even if you break a map out, all these places are not going to be on there, but the main ones will be on there. You know, the main places, Sinai, Plains of Moab, places like that. But yeah, so we've got every stop there. So with saying all of that and looking at that, I want to begin in verse 50, and I want to read some verses here because there is some significant things here. It says, "And the Lord spake to Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye are passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their pictures, destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places." Does anybody see the significance of this?
So they won't worship.
Exactly. All this stuff that he's talking about here is idolatry. The high places, the statues.
destroy competition.
Right, exactly. And so when they get into the land, they like the land. It's a land of milk and honey, but there's things left over, scattered out. I mean, we can't envision a place like they lived where idolatry was just everywhere. It was everyday life. Everything they did was involved in idolatry. There was statues and things scattered all throughout these lands. Israel wasn't like that. Israel had the tabernacle and the one true God. But these other nations, it's hard for us to put in the frame of mind of what that was like. Their political way of life was hemmed up in their idolatry. Like today, we might see signs out in people's yard, vote for so and so, and people's got their Trump flags or their Biden stuff or whatever. Well, for them, it was idolatry, and they had statues and they had all these different things. So he's saying here, when you get over to the land, you just need to make a complete riddance of all this stuff. Get it out. Get rid of it. Don't leave it around for the statues for your kids to use for toys and all that stuff. Get rid of all this stuff. That way you won't have the temptation to be there.
Your mind will not be polluted.
Right, and it's the lesson for us is if we have a problem with temptation in certain areas, the best way to fix that is just don't go around it. Just get it out of the way. Rather than sit there and torture yourself and put yourself in front of your temptations, you're better off just getting rid of those temptations. You're going to have a much easier time until you can get strong enough to where you can do better. So he says here, go out and drive out the inhabitants and get rid of all this idolatry stuff, because it's going to be a snare if you don't. Then he says in verse 53, "And ye shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell therein. For I have given you the land to possess it. And ye shall divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families. And to the more you shall give the more inheritance, and to the fewer you shall give less inheritance." That's only fair. He's saying, to the bigger tribes you give more land. To the smaller tribes you give less land. And it's not favoritism. It's just simply practical rules here. Then he says, "According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit." Now look at verse 55. This is an important verse. He says, "But if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which you let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein you dwell." So here's the point that he's making. If you don't drive out and completely cleanse the land, it's going to be a problem to you later on. And what do we see in the book of Judges? We see where they didn't completely rid the land sometimes whenever they were doing this in Joshua. Sometimes they ended up not being able to cleanse all the land and get all the people out like they were supposed to. And, there's some question as to whether it was their fault or not. There were some things that happened in Joshua where some people, I can see some looks here who knows what I'm talking about. There were some people who kind of deceived them and were deceptive about some things and made some oaths, and Israel agreed to it. Now, if Israel had been more on their game, it may not happen. But the point is, they made an oath where they couldn't drive all the people out, and since they didn't do that, by the time you get to the time of Judges, you see the problem. They end up going into idolatry. They turn their back on God. Then a judge raises up to deliver them. They do good for a while, then they get back into idolatry. They go back and they just go back and forth. Yeah, it's just like up and down. Did you have a question or comment?
I was just going to say that you see even later on where the Philistines can constantly give them problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's where David's problems came from. The Amalekites were Saul's problem, and the Philistines. You go on, and it falls right on down to the problems in the Middle East today. It all stems from them failing to clean up the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah, he makes that's why you need to underline this verse, because he's warning them beforehand, and you shouldn't be surprised when you get over to the book of Judges and you see the problems they had. It's because they didn't do what they were supposed to do here. And as I said, when you get to the book of Joshua, you can see, it's kind of, you just have to, I got to be your own judge, I guess, but they got into some trouble because they weren't able to get all the people out. But we see there the danger of whenever we decide to live for God and live right, we need to get all the former things and the way we used to live, all the things that were in opposition to God's will. We need to get rid of that. Get that out of our lives. And if we leave anything remaining, if we think, well, I'll just get rid of some of it, it's going to be a problem for us.
It wasn't so much that they weren't able to get rid of them, it's just that it got to be more trouble to them than it was worth.
Right. They could have done it.
They let their faith slide in God because God promised to eradicate everybody in front of them, basically, if they just stay faithful to Him.
Right. It wasn't because they couldn't do it. It's just because they should have been more on top of their game.
Lazy.
Yeah. Did you have a question or comment,
I
Gary?
was just saying that the thought popped in my head when you was talking about getting rid of all that. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from 2 Corinthians, I believe it is. Yeah, intermarrying. See, here's the problem. A lot of the dietary laws they had under Judaism, where they weren't allowed to eat certain meats and things, a lot of people think that was for sanitary purposes, but I have grave reservations that that's what that's all about. You see, the meats that they could eat as an Israelite, they were limited because the other nations that were around them, they used certain meats such as pork and things like that in idolatrous worship. Now, since the Israelites were forbidden to eat certain meats like that, if they were invited to a feast, a pagan feast, they could say immediately, God just help you with the temptation and just nip it in the bud. They'd say, I can't do that. I can't eat that. We are forbidden to eat those meats. So therefore that takes care of going out and hobnobbing, if you will, with people in pagan idolatry. It was a safeguard against them getting caught up and mingling and eating with these people and feasting with them and getting caught up in their idolatry. Now that's my take on that. You may see it differently. It may have had secondarily a sanitation, but I don't see that because in the New Testament every meat is good for food. So that wouldn't make sense to me. But we see here that they had dangers of drifting away because of these nations surrounding them. So And we see here he's warning them, if you don't do this, you're gonna suffer for it later. And they did. So, and then verse 56, it says, moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. And you know, this reaches its pinnacle in 1 Samuel 8, I believe it is. They said, give us a king so we can be like all the nations. You know, Samuel was perplexed. He was, you know, he couldn't understand why they would do that, because they were supposed to be doing the exact opposite of that. God was wanting them to be a light in the world and to shine that light, but instead, and be different. But instead, they wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted to conform to their ways, and so that they paid for that. Okay, that wraps up chapter 33. Are there any questions or comments on this one? All right, chapter 34. We have here some verses where he talks about dividing the land. I'll read a few verses here. I don't want to read every verse, but I'll read some. It says in verse 1, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, command the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you come into the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall unto you for an inheritance, even the land of Canaan with the coast thereof. Then your south quarter shall be from the wilderness of Zin, along by the coast of Edom, and your south border should be outmost coast of the Salt Sea. And so he goes through here and he gives the borders of the land, and he says, this is how you need to divide it. So I believe Scotty brought up in one class here recently about earlier on when God promised Abraham, he didn't point out and say it's going to be exactly, you know, down to the proportion how the land of Canaan was going to be. Well, here he is. He's getting giving more detailed instructions about where the borders will be and all that different kind of thing. So, and that, like I said, right here, they're going to divide the land up. And let's see here. Verse 13, it says, Moses commanded the children of Israel, saying, this is the land which ye shall inherit by lot, which the Lord commanded to give unto the 9 tribes and to the half tribe. For the tribe of the children of Reuben, according to the house of their fathers, and the tribe of the children of Gad, according to the house of their fathers, have received their inheritance, and the half tribe of Manasseh have received their inheritance. The 2 tribes and the half tribe have received their inheritance on this side Jordan, that is, on the east side, the east side Jordan near Jericho, eastward toward the sun rising. So he's alluding back here to what we studied last week when Ephraim, Gad, and Manasseh, they decided they wanted to have the land for their cattle and go over and fight and come back and get the land. And let's see here. That basically wraps up chapter 34 too. So since we've got time left, we might as well just go ahead and go into chapter 30. Well, are there any questions or comments? I don't want to go too fast here. If anybody has any questions. All right, so chapter 35. Now this is an interesting chapter. This has to do with what they call the cities of refuge. And we know in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, that there was apparently the beginning of civil government all the way back there in chapter 9, verse 6, because he lays down a principle there. Let me just go back and read this. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. I'll just start out in verse 1. It says, God blessed Noah. This is after the flood and everything like that. It says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, upon all the fishes of the sea, and to your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. But the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. And surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. So here we have, for the first time, the principle of the punishment, the penalty for murder. And we've seen already, if you remember the book of Genesis, the first murderer was Cain. He murdered his brother because he was righteous and he was a self-righteous man. But we see here that he lays down this definite principle about the fact that whoever takes the life of somebody, the punishment for that is for your life to be forfeited, because there's no other way to pay for that. When you take somebody, if a man goes out and murders somebody, that they've taken away that man's life. There's no way to recompense that but to forfeit your own life. And so he lays this principle down here, and we still go by this same principle today in the United States. We still believe in the death penalty for people and capital punishment for people who commit murder. And it started all the way back here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. So, I said all that to say this. Over in the book of Numbers in chapter 35, these cities of refuge, this is going to have to do with people who, what do they call it? Is it manslaughter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you do it but it's not intentional?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, he's going to make an exception for certain things that happen, because it could be that there had been an accident. It is possible for a man to take another man's life by accident. And so he's going to deal with that in this chapter. Let me just read some verses to it. This is an interesting chapter, by the way. Chapter 35, verse 1, it says, "The Lord spake to Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho, saying, Command the children of Israel that they give unto the Levites of the inheritance of their possession cities to dwell in, and ye shall give also unto the Levites suburbs for cities round about them. And the cities shall they have to dwell in, and the suburbs of them shall be for their cattle, and for their goods, and for all their beasts. And the suburbs of the cities which ye shall give unto the Levites shall reach from the wall of the city, and outward 1,000 cubits round about. And ye shall measure from without the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, on the south side 2,000 cubits, on the west side 2,000 cubits, on the north side 2,000 cubits. And the city shall be in the midst. This shall be to them the suburbs of the cities. And among the cities which ye shall give unto the Levites, there shall be 6 cities for refuge, which ye shall appoint for the manslayer, that he may flee thither, and to them ye shall add 42 cities. So all the cities which ye shall give to the Levites shall be 48 cities, them shall ye give with their suburbs." So we remember earlier we were studying about the Levites that they wouldn't get an inheritance of land. They wouldn't inherit any land, but instead they would be scattered throughout in the different tribes throughout the nation, because part of their responsibility was to teach. They were to know the law and to help teach the people. So they would have 42 cities to live in, but they would also have 6 other cities spread throughout the land, which were called cities of refuge. And we see here the person that committed manslaughter, they would go to these cities of refuge, and they would be brought to trial before the judges of Israel, and they would determine whether or not it was an accident or not. Now, is everybody with me so far? Yeah, this is a pretty unique thing. I mean, it's I didn't know about this for a long time. When I learned about it, I thought it was pretty interesting. So let me read through, let's see here. Let me read through some of the stipulations here. Verse 16, it says, if he smite him, let's see. I'll begin in verse 15. These 6 cities shall be a refuge both for the children of Israel and for the stranger and for the sojourner among them, that everyone that killeth any person unawares may flee thither. And if he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he smite him with the throwing of a stone wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he smite him with a hand weapon of wood wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And the revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer when he meeteth him, and shall slay him. So this here is talking about intentional. This is talking about if somebody goes out here and he's got something against somebody and he murders somebody. He says there's no protection for this man.
Premeditated.
Right, it's premeditated. And he's basically making the point, the revenger, which would be the closest of kin to the one that was killed, if he was in the cities of refuge, apparently, if he saw him out somewhere, he had the legal right to take that man's life. So you forfeit your life if back here under this law whenever you commit a murder. Verse 20, it says, but if he thrust him of hatred or hurl at him by lying of weight that he die, or in enmity smite him with his hand that he die, he that smote him shall surely be put to death, for he is a murderer. The revenger of blood shall slay the murderer when he meet him. So we see here that whether it was in the heat of the moment and you did it on purpose, or whether it was because of hatred and you planned it out, he said if you do it purposely, there's no protection for that. Now, verse 22 beginning, he looks at a different case. He says, but if he thrust him suddenly without enmity, or have cast upon him without lying in wait. So here's a case of self-defense. You know, let's say that somebody's coming at you and you try to defend yourself, and you defending yourself, you mess around and actually take somebody's life. That's a different story. That's unintentional. Verse 23, or with any stone wherewith a man may die, seeing him not, and cast it upon him that he may die, and was not his enemy, neither sought his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood according to these judgments. So then they would be brought before the judges there, and they would hear the case, and they would decide whether or not it was accidental or not, or whether it was something that he had done on purpose. Verse 25 says, the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whither he was fled, and he shall abide in it unto the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil. Isn't that interesting? So, if he was innocent, he could go and stay in this city of refuge. Now, death, this kind of thing is so serious that even if it was unintentional, you're still going to pay consequences. If you have to stay in that city of refuge, look at the things you're giving up. You're not going to be around people that you were living around before. You're kind of going to be, living in a different place. You're going to have to stay there until the death of the high priest. And when the death of the high priest occurred, then you were free to go back to your land. Does that symbolize anything to you?
Captivity.
Captivity?
Will they get in captivity later?
I never thought of that. That's an interesting thought. Anybody else? So Jesus is our high priest, and he died upon the cross to redeem us from our sins. So, I don't know if there's anything there, but I was studying about it, and, I thought that maybe that could have something to do with it. So when they killed somebody, even though they were innocent, they were confined to that city of refuge. But at the death of the high priest, they were freed up. They could go back to their home, and the revenger of blood couldn't do anything. Jesus is our high priest. He went to the cross. He died for our sins and redeemed us from sin. That way we're not in bondage to sin. So that basically covers, and then he goes ahead and he talks about the fact that later on in the chapter how if the man doesn't stay in the city of refuge, if he ends up dallying around and going outside the city of refuge, he's not protected by the law. If the revenger of blood saw him outside, he could kill him, and there was nothing, no consequences. But if he stayed in the city of refuge, he's protected. So, and then he talks about the end of the chapter in verse 34, defile not therefore the land which ye shall inhabit, wherein I dwell, for I the Lord dwell among the children of Israel. So whenever murder was committed in the land and the law was not carried out, that defiled the land. That made God not able to bless them. And so these cities of refuge and keeping up this law was very important. Are there any questions or comments on this chapter? All right, that brings us up to chapter 36. This is a good place to stop tonight. We went over a little bit, but that's all right. On Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll begin in chapter 36, and we'll wrap up the book of Numbers and be ready for the book of Deuteronomy. And I've got some introductory material. I'm getting it ready for Deuteronomy, so be ready if you want to read ahead, maybe read chapter 1 or something like that, and we'll get started on that on Wednesday. Thank you for your attention. All right. Go go ahead and get into our invitation portion for tonight. For tonight, I want to look at some verses in the book of Hebrews. And this kind of goes with what we've been studying in the book of Numbers, how they were, these people had been treated by God in such a favorable way, and they forgot about that. God, when He saw them down in Egypt in slavery, He heard their cries. They were in trouble. They were crying out to God, and God sent Moses down to deliver them. He heard the prayers. He heard that. And He reaches out by His grace to help them and bring them out of Egypt. So He sends Moses down with the plagues to show Pharaoh that, yes, I am with Moses. This is my man. And using those miracles to confirm the word that Moses speaks. Let my people go. Let them go. And whenever He did that, the people, the Egyptians and Pharaoh, they hardened their hearts, and they didn't want to do it. He would see a plague, and then he'd say, okay, I'll let you go. Then he'd change his mind. He'd go back and forth, and he kept trying to fight against God and fight against God. And finally, we see where Moses, God comes to him and says, I'm going to do one last plague and one last miracle, and then He's going to let you go. And of course, He tells them to take the lamb and kill it and strike the blood on the doorpost. And whenever the Lord sees the blood, He'll pass over and not kill. He'll spare the firstborn where He sees the blood. And so what happens is they do that, and there's the death of the firstborn all throughout the land of Egypt. It says there was a cry heard that was not heard any time since then, or never since, because of the death of the firstborn, of Pharaoh, of the lowest in Egypt to the highest. All the firstborn were killed. And so what happens is Moses, Pharaoh tells them to get out of the land, and so they go out in the wilderness, and they get out there, and it looks like they're caught up. They get to the Red Sea, it looks like they're hemmed up. And God did that purposely. Sometimes we look around walking with God in Christianity, and we look around and it doesn't make sense to us, and we think that we're in the lurch. God's left us in the lurch, but He hasn't. God will lead you in the right way. He knows what He's doing. And so what happens is the Egyptians and Pharaoh decides, I want to fight one last time and try to fight against God. So he brings his host out there behind, gets them hemmed. He thought they're hemmed up in the wilderness. He comes up behind at the Red Sea. And of course, God tells Moses to put up the staff, put up the rod, and split the sea open. And so he parts the Red Sea, and they walk by faith on dry ground through the Red Sea. And of course, they're redeemed out of Egypt. That's the symbol to all the world that God had brought this nation out of Egypt. And of course, the Egyptians essayed to do what they did, and they weren't doing it by faith. God closed up the Red Sea and destroyed the most powerful army on the earth at that time. And so when they get out in the wilderness, now they're looking to Canaan. They're ready to go to the Promised Land. And so today, whenever we're living in Christianity, we're going through a wilderness sometimes. We're going through trials. God's trying to help us, to train us to trust Him. And we look around and we can't understand why are all these things happening. And we complain about inconveniences and things like that instead of being thankful that God is blessing us. But if we keep our faith and do what God says and learn the lesson, we'll make it to the Promised Land. Amen? We'll make it to heaven. We're looking to heaven. Canaan was symbolic of heaven. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're striving for. Now listen to what Paul says in Hebrews chapter 4. He alludes back to these wilderness wanderings. He says, let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left of us, entering into His rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. So the problem was they didn't have trust. They had the word, they had what God says, but they didn't have the trust to do what they needed to do to hang in there. Verse 3, it says, For we which have believed do enter into His rest, as He said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest. So there's a condition. It's not just, it's not a sure thing. Heaven, while we're living on this earth, we're in a trial run here. We need to keep our faith and make sure that we're on guard against Satan and his devices and what he's trying to do, and make sure we're on guard with our faith. Because we're looking for heaven, and it's not a sure thing. It is a sure thing if we keep our faith, but my point is there's the danger of us wavering in our faith and doing like the Israelites and getting off the path and going into apostasy. So we've got to keep our faith strong. Verse 4 says, For He spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all His works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, Today, after so long a time, as it is said, Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus, that is Joshua, for if Jesus had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remaineth therefore a rest for the people of God. For he that has entered into rest, he also has ceased from his own works as God did from us. And then he says in verse 11, Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. So we see here that we need to be learning from these principles and these occasions back in the Old Testament where Israel is failing to trust in God. They think that God is not able to get them into the promised land. And because of that lack of belief and that lack of faith, it caused them to be going around in a maze and a labyrinth in the wilderness for 40 years. And that whole first generation was wiped off, was wiped out because they didn't do what God said. They didn't get to see the promised land. Moses didn't get to see the promised land. We need to be careful and make sure that we keep our faith strong and do what we have to do to enter into that rest, to enter into heaven, and make sure that we do what God says so we'll be one day saved in eternity with Him. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian and you want to live and fight the good fight of faith and do what it takes to keep your faith strong and one day enter into that promised land, well, it starts with a simple, obeying the simple plan of the gospel salvation. That is repentance, confession, and baptism. This is God's simple plan of salvation to start your walk. You know, you haven't even started your wanderings yet. You haven't even started your journey yet if you haven't followed these instructions. So if you're here tonight, you're not a Christian, we're here to help you with that. We want to help you learn more about that. And if you have any questions or comments, we want to talk with you. There's people here qualified to talk with you if you want to talk in private or anything like that. But we're here for you if you'd like to do that. If you're a Christian and you've strayed off in the narrow path, you can be brought back into the fold by repentance, confession, and prayer. Whatever your need is tonight, we're here for you. Please come as together we stand and sing.